So I'm Michael White. I work for VMware. I'm a specialist in the area of BCDR. That is actually my title up there, but I'm getting tired of saying it. It's way too long. It's inefficient, I think. What I really do is I hang around with QA people, developers like Pat here, and customers, and quite frankly, mostly with customers, and I help them make BCDR-type things work. So that's Site Recovery Manager, that's VDR, and to be honest, I even help today some people about tape backup with virtual machines. But I have a lot of experience. I've recovered dead data centers, and I've protected data centers from harm, and both of those kinds of experience make it very, very useful for you to ask questions, and I can share answers and hopefully knowledge. I need you actually to ask questions. Often in these events, like in fact now coming in late, we have product managers. So when you have a question, even when we answer the question, it's actually important for the product managers to know that you asked the question because they can get clues, they can get ideas, and they can be comfortable about decisions they've made. So those questions aren't just so that you get answers, which of course is the number one thing, but it's so that we learn as well. While I'm on the subject, just so that I don't forget, if you give me, or if you give the product manager there your card, we would be happy to place you on the list for the potential beta users of what we're going to talk about today. And we actually have a large stack already for you. So we'll just, and Pat, who's here with me, and we work together on this presentation, he'll chat with you all in about half, I guess, more or less. But we're all here. This would be the slide that's easy when you're tired and haven't slept for a long time and been drinking too much. This can provide a great deal of entertainment. So those of you who know me, I have a style for these presentations that you can see on this slide deck that I'd like you to remember. The agenda, which I usually spend almost no time on, but I do know that some of you I don't recognize. The appendix in brackets means that there is about, I think, 20-some or 30-some slides that we cut from this presentation. Like my VMware data recovery presentation I've done here, this one is how we, inside VMware, are accumulating information to empower our developers or our SEs so that we know what's going on with the product, even though it's not yet a product. So you have that benefit right here with a whole bunch of extra knowledge. So when you look at this on VMworld.com, you will be able to listen to me and watch the slides at the same time. But you won't see anything in the appendix. So that you'll have to download the presentation. And there'll be notes. There are notes, not many, but there's a few down below each slide, and then there's the appendix. So make sure you take advantage of that if, in fact, you're interested and want to learn more. So everybody here likely knows what Site Recovery Manager is. That might be because, of course, you use it, or maybe you've seen it. It'd be nice, in fact, if some of you were people that have actually used Site Recovery Manager to change data centers, or if you had a core network switch go down, or if you had a storm, which I think is coming to a place near us today, in fact. Well, SRM is a great tool to evacuate your virtual machines out of a data center so that when that storm hits, wherever it hits, it isn't going to impact your ability to make money or pay your employees. That's what Site Recovery Manager is. It came from us watching you do virtualization disaster recovery and all the pain points that you had, things like executing scripts, things like re-IPing machines, things like managing storage. We learned from you, and we turn that into a workflow. And as a result, that gives us the simplified and automated setup and failover of virtual machines. The one on here that's quite important is testing. Testing is how you become successful. I don't know of a single case where people did a test failover with SRM the first time and it worked. It's very hard to have all of the applications, all of the components, all of the pieces within that first test. But when you do the first test and it doesn't work, that starts you on a path, a journey to discover the elements that you need to have in that test. Sometimes companies don't know all of the components that make up an application. So the testing here is a big deal. The more you test, the more likely things are going to work when you need them in a crisis. Something else I like is if you have manual recovery runbooks already, that's going to make implementing SRM that much easier for you because you have the knowledge in those manual DR runbooks that cover off, the things like which application is most important and which is least important. And the fact that everything works within the vSphere client is nice as well because it means you already know a little bit about using vSphere or SRM. And what you're going to see, too, in a screenshot is you guys have maybe never seen HBR before, and I'll explain what that means and what it stands for later, but you already know how to use it. You already know how to replicate virtual machines, and you haven't even seen it yet. And that's partially because of this, the central management within the vSphere client. So this is the SRM today logical diagram. And notice what we have here. We have our replicated storage. We have our ESX servers on both sides. We have our virtual center on both sides. SRM on both sides. We have our vSphere client on both sides. We have our databases that our applications need. And we have this little thing that's the bane of the existence of our support organization, and it complicates my life rather significantly as well. It is the storage replication adapter. It's what allows you in Virtual Center to hit the green button and actually have your replication not touched, but have a clone or a snapshot, depending on your technology, have a snapshot actually promoted and visible to ESX and thus able to inventory the virtual machines on it. That green button executes storage and SRM or Virtual Center commands, so very handy. And the storage part of that is possible because of the SRA. So this is SRM today. This is what's running in the big red truck, which I think is already gone. It's what's running in the labs. It's what you may have played with in the labs or you have in your company. And what we're going to talk about right now is SRM of the future. The next major release of SRM is going to have the ability to do a number of different things. Thanks to people like Olga, who's sitting here, we actually have a very new interface. So it's going to be very much different than what you're used to, but I can tell you that it's very much more natural than what we have now. It's more comfortable, which I guess doesn't sound very right, but when you use it, you'll see what I mean. It's just a little more logical. It's going to have a bunch of new features. In fact, in the next room here, they're talking about one of them that's called automated failback. So that's sort of cool. But we have something, I think, much more cool to talk about. It's called host-based replication. Host-based replication is not quite what you might expect. In fact, somebody this morning heard about it, and they were quite worried that it was double-take-like, and it was a double-take guy talking to me, actually. In the industry, host-based means inside the virtual machine, inside the physical machine, an agent is doing replication. Double-take and vReplicator are two examples. To us, it's a little different. Host-based to us actually means ESX host. And that is very important to you. In fact, I think we have slides on it. But what that means to you is the virtual machine that's working isn't doing the replication. So it means less of an impact on the virtual machine. What's really important here is what we're talking about in some of the next points. Today, you have to have storage arrays on both sides. And those storage arrays have to be able to communicate. They have to be able to replicate. I was talking to a very large customer a little while ago, and they've just decided that they're going to use NetApp, I think I can say that, in their newest data center. So they have another data center, or no, it's EqualLogic, in fact. And that data center is going to have a completely different storage infrastructure than their other data centers, one of which is IBM and one of which is EMC. So, of course, that makes SRM very difficult for them because those aren't able to communicate, and yet they have to communicate, so then they go out and buy another product and put it in between each of those data centers, and now they get replication, and thus they can use SRM. But generally, if you don't have buckets of money, you need to have two storage arrays that talk to each other. So generally what that means is not everybody has that, and there's a whole bunch of people that can't buy SRM because they don't have those storage arrays. It's a little more interesting that as well, because there are customers today who have storage or Site Recovery Manager, but they have some really important offices that don't have shared storage, but yet they're running virtual machines. They might be recording how much gas comes out of the ground into a SQL server. So it's a really, and I've turned one of those ones off once when I was in a bit of a crisis, and we lost $34 million because I had it off for half an hour. So that's a pretty big deal. That would easily justify buying SRM, but for SRM in that position, we'd need to buy a storage array, and that's actually quite a bit of money. So that's where HBR comes in. HBR will allow you to replicate between two environments that do not have storage in common. Real-life example to make sure we're all on the same page is you have a branch office that has a local hard drive, and there's a virtual machine running on it that is of critical importance, and you decide to protect it. HBR will replicate that single lone virtual machine back to your head office. And for all we care, you could put it on a shared storage there. So, very powerful. This is the architecture when there is no storage arrays in common, when there is, in fact, HBR in use. And it looks a little bit different. We got some blue stuff out here that Pat is going to describe to you later. What's really important is notice our storage is not replicating. That's the key. If I could have found someone who could draw, which I'm not much for, I would have probably not even had this box, and I would have had a local hard drive drawn for the ESX, because I think that just makes a really much more impressionable subject or description. But it doesn't matter if this is local, doesn't matter if it's shared, doesn't matter if it's common. The fact is they can be completely different. We do have some new infrastructure here that, like I said, Pat will talk about. But we have our traditional ESX servers, Virtual Center, SRM. Everything else looks the same. What we're actually doing here, what we're talking about, is adding native replication to a virtual machine. And that means, because of the way we're doing it, it does not matter where it rests. It can be on NFS, it can be on iSCSI, it can be on something else. If it's got a VMFS partition or not, we can replicate it just fine. The other thing is because it's managed as the property of a virtual machine, this is one that sort of makes me smile. I think it's really quite impressive. Even if you accidentally storage vMotion it to the wrong place, even if you move it from shared storage to a local hard drive or something like that, well, we don't really care. Pat cares because he did a lot of work to make that work, but we don't care because we don't even notice a blip. The fact is it just keeps replicating. Sort of like what we do with the vShield stuff when we put a rule in our firewall for virtual machines. If they move around, that rule follows them because we're not applying the rule according to an IP address. We're applying that rule to a virtual machine as a property, just like we're doing here. The other thing that I like is this last line, because we're not doing the replication inside the virtual machine. There is a very minimum impact on the virtual machine because we're doing it outside the virtual machine at the ESX host level. In addition, all we're sending are the deltas. So really, the amount of impact on the ESX host, though we don't know it yet, we can't talk about it, I expect it to be reasonable. Here are some details for us. This one's sort of interesting. You can opt to replicate all of the disks, or if in fact there's a disk that you don't care about, such as in a NetApp shop where it might be a page file disk, you don't have to replicate it. It also means something else that's related to this one here that impresses me still to no end. The way this has been designed, you can actually use what I used to call the FedEx method, where I would have an external hard drive. I would replicate to it. I would put it in a FedEx box or in somebody's suitcase, and I would send it to the other location. They would hook it to the network, and then I would continue on with the replication. We used to have to do that because we had very, very small pipes. Well, now we got big pipes, but we have ginormous virtual machines. So you can still do that. You can actually choose to replicate, you can choose to copy a virtual machine that you're about to replicate to an external hard drive, put it on an airplane, send it to wherever it is that you want to replicate, and then you can start replicating. And what will actually happen is we'll look at those two disks, we'll see what the differences are, and we'll continue on replicating. So a very handy feature, I think. Here's something else that is a big deal, and it's something that you'll have to think a little bit about. We aren't going to give you a schedule. What we're going to give you is the opportunity to select what your recovery point objective is. In other words, the English translation is how much data can you afford to lose? In other words, we're going to give you a sliding scale that starts at 15 minutes and goes to 24 hours. And as you can imagine, 24 hours means not very much going out over the wire. We're not using much bandwidth. But if in point of fact you select 15 minutes, then we're going to be pushing more over the wire to keep things consistent. Here's something that is good to remember. We don't use VMware snapshots. There are no redo logs to be worried about or to manage on the protected side. We are using, in fact, what we're using is sort of like change block tracking. I hope everyone here knows a little bit about change block tracking. It's a very important feature of vSphere that allows for radically different backup methods and shorter. Well, this doesn't use change block tracking because it's been around longer, but it uses something like change block tracking. The software actually tracks the blocks that are changed, and the blocks that are changed are the ones that the deltas are shipped, and the blocks that haven't changed, well, we don't do anything, so it's very efficient. When you download SRM, oh, that's a funny question. I just saw the box for it recently. Has anybody here ever seen the box for SRM? Has anybody ever, got a CD from us for SRM, or ESX for that matter? I met the lady who designs those boxes. I'm never, ever going to say anything to her about how infrequently we see them. And in fact, I tried to meet up with her to ask her for one, because I thought it would be sort of nice to put, a box up here and to have it in my library, but she got away. So what we're looking at here is the traditional outline for doing an install, but there's an extra couple of steps in here, and that's where we install HBR and where we pair it. The thing that's nice here is there's no install program for it. What there is the SRM install program, and as a part of installing SRM, up here is an example you may remember today. We pair SRM between two sites. Well, the next thing after that is we install the host-based management server, or host-based replication management server, and then we pair it. But it's all within the SRM install program, and it's all within the SRM UI. So very straightforward. And right here, I hope you guys notice, I'm a big fan of OVF. That's a great way to install things. That's how you can have VDR up and running in, 5 minutes, is because you suck it in and have it deployed through an OVF file. Very handy, and that's what we're doing here with respect to installing HBR. You remember how I mentioned you guys already know how to replicate? Check out this screenshot. We see right here where it says HBR replication. Well, in fact, it came right here by right-clicking on a virtual machine. That's sort of cool when you think about it. I'm sure somebody thought long and hard, and I bet you Olga had some input about how it would be best for people. But when you think about it, that's what we do now. Look at all the things that we have here that you're used to using on a VM by VM basis. And so we've just added in the top HBR replication, or at the bottom, pardon me. Hi.
Is it going to be like VM snapshots where you have to hunt each one, or is there going to be a page where they actually collect all of them?
So the question is there a place where we can go to see all of them, or do we have to do it here? And that's whoops, almost said that was a good question, but in this room today, every question that people ask is a good question. So the story here is pretty good, though. When you go to a different tab, which if we click on Finance as an example, there'll be a tab that says Virtual Machines. You can shift-click just like you can today to turn on or off and take care of it there. Why would we not see this? I already know there's going to be support calls to GSS about I can't find the darn thing, and Michael said it was going to be there. Pardon me? Exactly, it's a plugin. The SRM plugin has to be installed, otherwise you won't see this, I'm told. Now we've highlighted still the same virtual machine, and we've gone across, and there's actually a new tab, and that tab is called HBR Replication. This is a really important tab for you guys because this is, I think, going to be one of your two areas to look for troubleshooting information. We can see here where it's actually going to. We can see that the RPO that was selected by the user was 6 hours. We can see it's successful. And we can see the date and time of the last synchronization or the last replication. So very handy. This is how you can tell I'm not a real marketing guy. And that's, in fact, why I think our group is called technical marketing. Because the marketing guys would probably not want you to see all these errors and all these different colors. They'd probably want you to see just the whole mess of green. But I think this is beautiful because this is showing you all the possibilities. You guys know about blue being the in use, or it's working right now. And below it, we can see yellow, which is a new color for us. That means, in this context, that we have completed the replication, but there were no errors, but I noticed something. It's sort of like a warning or a notice. And in this case, it's hard to see, but you can actually see where it was successful, but there was an RPO violation. And that is sort of interesting. That can be, for example, if somebody has replicated a virtual machine and then somebody just added a new hard drive to it. So now instead of one hard drive, it has two. It's never been replicated before. You're not using the FedEx method, so it's going to take more time to replicate than usual, and it might exceed the 6 hours or the 2 hours. And that would be an example of how you would have a successful replication, but it took longer than the RPO said it should, and thus it's yellow. And of course, below it, fairly obvious, red is bad. That's why the SRAs in my presentation are always red, because they're frustrating. In this case, we've got some examples where it had a snapshot error, it had a disk not configured, and it had a data store inaccessible. So you get the error right here. So this is the second place, I think, when you're quickly troubleshooting things that I would go, because this shows you the status of all the different VMs being replicated. This, incidentally, is our new and improved UI. It does look a little different, but you'll notice you recognize things in here like recovery plans or array managers, but they are just arranged a little different, and the individual screens work a little different. What we're talking about here is doing a little bit of a comparison to try and make sure we all understand and we're all on the same page about host-based replication. What we have over here, we talk about things like, as an example, we let you select how much data staleness, or what we call staleness, you'll be able to tolerate. That's 2 hours or 6 hours. Whereas on the array side, we actually do a schedule. So every 2 hours or every 10 minutes or every 10 seconds, you replicate. And we're using here something a little different. Question?
Actually, two questions. One is, how do you build the QoS around, how do you Second is, how do you make sure your replication, how do you keep your data consistency on the replication?
Okay. I understand. So first question, what was the first question again?
Quality of service.
QoS, thank you. It's been a long day. So the QoS question means, how do we manage a quality of service on our WAN links while we're replicating? The fact is, we don't do anything for that. In fact, we don't encrypt our connection. That data being replicated is in the clear so that you can decide to do QoS with it. So the routers between your two sites, the firewalls between your two sites, you can do a site-to-site VPN for security, and then you can do some kind of QoS setting on it so it doesn't take too much. But that's the answer. You have that ability. Second one was consistency. I'll just wait till, That's why I have a vibrate. It's gone off twice. It's quite irritating. It's right on my hip bone, but at least you guys didn't know. My phone went off. So the second question is about consistency. What we do, and in fact it's on one of our slides later, but you asked now, I'll answer now. We provide consistent disks for one virtual machine. So each virtual machine, regardless of the number of disks attached, arrive at the other location in a consistent way. We do not yet provide consistency across a group of virtual machines. This is 1.0, and what we can do in the time that we have been allotted is the consistency of the disks that are attached to a VM. You can imagine that might be something we'll improve in the future. What we see in here is the replication is managed at a per VM granularity, which is correct. This part is not to be underestimated or downplayed, the strong integration with the platform. The fact that you can right-click on a VM and say replicate's pretty darn handy. In fact, that whole process, the screenshots are in the appendix. But that's a very handy thing. I forgot to say something, too, at the beginning, by the way. These are all real screenshots. It's a real application. It's not out in beta. It's not being delivered. But it's a real application. But don't forget, we might change it. If Asmir hears your questions and decides that something doesn't make sense or it's confusing, we may still change it. In fact, probably would to make it better. So the screenshots that we see in here, they're real at the time I took them, or that Pat took them. Please don't hold that against me if the HBR Status tab has a different name. Or if when you right-click and it says HBR Replication, if it says something else, somebody made that decision, but we can't help it. On the other side, the array-based replication, it talks about we manage the replication within a group of LUNs and with a schedule versus an RPO and an individual VM. Configuration at each side must match. We know about that. Here's one that's a big deal for me. Configuration of the replication is done outside of the vSphere client. We have 19 storage partners for SRM, and I have a very difficult time knowing even a subset of their replication software. We have one guy, his name is Lee, works in the UK, and he knows almost all of them, which is an extraordinary feat. So that's why I love the fact that the configuration of the replication for our replication product is not only easy, but it's in vCenter. I think that's very handy. Here's a bit of a comparison on that. The idea of schedules that most arrays use dictate when replication should begin and don't change according to past behavior. On our side, it's a little different. You can actually have a replicated VM preceded by having something FedEx to another side. And then we'll just start up with the deltas. But look at this one, using past behavior. The fact is HBR will watch the replication that it's doing and understand how it has gone in the past. In other words, how long it took. And what it'll do is it'll say, okay, that took 2 hours or 10 hours or whatever, and it'll use that information to help it decide when it should start the next replication in order to make sure that it meets that 6-hour or 2-hour RPO. Yeah.
In the past slide, you were talking about arrays versus an HBR. If you already have an array that's set up to do replication, is there any reason why you would rather do HBR versus array?
So this question is about, we have storage array support and we have HBR support, and we'll continue to do that, by the way. And is there any idea or thought about which you would use where? Well, some of my answer will depend on what the final shipping version is. But right now, giving you an answer, I would say that if I had a couple of thousand virtual machines, I would probably continue to replicate them as I do today. If I had a smaller number of virtual machines out at a remote site, then I would use HBR with that. But the fact is we support both of them, and you can make the decision in your particular situation what works the best for you. And to be honest, that's what VMware is about in many, many different ways. It's about empowering you with choices that you can tune for your own environment. Here's our second not really the second, but here's our logical diagram again, and this is where Pat's going to take over and start working through some of the infrastructure that I didn't talk about that's part of HBR. Your laser and your flipper.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so as Michael said, my name is Patrick Tolman. I'm a senior staff engineer at VMware. I've been working on the implementation of HBR. And if you've got questions at any point, please chime in, and Michael can answer them.
Actually, I have a question. How long have you been working on this?
So I personally have been working on HBR for about a year. The other people at VMware have been working on it longer.
So doesn't that make you sort of feel good? It does me. When these guys have been working on it for a year, and we're not even in beta yet, that's sort of reassuring for me. It means that the beta is going to be a little easier. At least I hope so.
I should be working on it right now. So I'm going to be talking about the new components that will be added to SRM or to your infrastructure to enable host-based replication. And so on the primary site, we'll be making some changes to the ESX hosts, which deliver the sort of the core replication of disks. At the secondary site, we have an HBR server that receives the updates and farms them out to your storage. And then there's this HMS server, which is the management layer. You can think of that sort of like an SRA for HBR. So the replication is these two pieces, and then this is sort of analogous to an SRA. Question? The question is, can the HMS instance be on the SRM server? Right now, these components will all be delivered, or the HMS and the HBR server will be delivered as separate virtual appliances. So there won't be any way to install it directly. There's no technical reason you couldn't, sort of have a bigger server with them all on there. But at least the initial deployment will be as separate virtual appliances. Question? Yes. Not physical RDMs, but the virtual RDMs are supported for HBR. And they can be different on either side. So you could replicate from a virtual RTM to a thick disk or something. So the first component is the HBR agent. This is the component that ships with ESX that enables host-based replication. And there's two parts to enabling host-based replication. One is the part that sits in ESX in the VM kernel, watches a virtual machine's disk traffic, keeps track of which blocks have changed and haven't changed, and then sends out those changes when an RPO an instance is created. When we create that instance, we make a consistent instance of all of the disks of that virtual machine. So independent of where that VM's individual disks lives, if some of them are on storage, some of them are on local or shared storage, some of them are local storage, it's still a consistent instance at the virtual machine layer. We make a consistent instance of that, and then figure out which blocks need to be shipped over to the remote side to make the remote side have a copy of that instance. We do support, or we will be supporting in the first version, VSS integration, so it can be an OS file system consistent snapshot, or if your applications hook into VSS in Windows. There's some caveats around that, but if you need more details, come talk to me afterwards. The second part of the ESX agent's support for host-based replication is the scheduling. So each ESX host knows which VMs running on that host are enabled for replication, what their RPO schedules are, sort of what bandwidth it's been seeing to the remote site, and how many blocks it knows each VM needs to replicate. So it can say, well, the RPO schedule for this one is 15 minutes. It took about 5 minutes last time, so I'll try to start at 7 or 8 minutes before the deadline so that the instance is complete and at the remote site before the RPO schedule hits. And so that scheduling and logic will happen on each ESX host for the VMs running on that host. The next component for the HBR infrastructure is the HBR server, which is running at your recovery site, and is what receives the updates. So all of the ESX hosts on the primary are tracking block changes, sending deltas out. Those deltas arrive at this HBR server. This HBR server has been configured to know this virtual machine's disks mapped to these VMDKs on local storage or shared storage or whatever the storage is at the replica site. Question? The question is, do we support synchronous replication and not? The first release is async down to sort of a 15-minute RPO is the fastest that goes in the first release. The HBR server is a Linux virtual appliance. Yes, question? The question is there any built-in compression or WAN acceleration? And no, there's not. We expect you'll be able to get that out of your network infrastructure, hopefully, or something we can look in at adding in later releases. But the first release, we will send out the raw data.
Can I just add to that? I think we don't want to do that. I'm speaking for myself. What I mean is if we do that, then we're going to make it harder for you to use your tools to do some of that stuff. So I think us leaving it in plain text is giving you the most flexibility to do things like that yourselves. And I could be wrong, and if I am, you guys need to complain or you need to say something, but until then, I think it's better for you to have the flexibility to use the tools that you have.
So this HBR server, we expect we will only need to run one of these on your replication site, but you can scale up adding additional HBR servers. And it's important to mention that these virtual appliances, the HMS and the HBR servers, are managed entirely through the HBR UI. You can add new instances of them, take them offline, see their status, all that through the existing UI. You won't have to go look at the virtual appliance console in normal use. I mean, you'll see this VM in your inventory, but otherwise you shouldn't really care that it's a VM. So deployed, configured, and managed through SRM. The HBR server can write to any kind of disk. Yeah, question?
What do you expect for sizing considerations when you expect to have?
So the HBR server, sort of the default configuration is a single vCPU, 512 megs. The important thing is the network connections for it. It will be receiving network data from the primary site, and then it'll be sending out network data to the local ESX hosts that actually write to the storage. So this appliance doesn't have direct access to the replica storage. It's through the ESX hosts. So it's just doing networking. So it's effectively a proxy, yes. So we don't have any we'll have better scaling numbers of sort of how many VMs, but in our current setups, we think your sort of storage bandwidth will be the limit before the appliance becomes the limit. Question in the back?
Is there a limitation to the number of ESX servers VMs with
So the question is there a limit to the number of ESX hosts that can be managed with HBR? And we expect to scale at the vCenter scalability limits. So we'd be sort of surprised if someone is that maxed out and isn't using array-based replication, but that's sort of the targets we're aiming for the scalability of the product. Question?
Do you expect to have anything to do multi-site failover handling SRM?
So the question's about multi-site failover, and so sort of higher level SRM architecture is the same with host-based replication and array-based replication. So you can do where you have your protected site protecting, or your site A and your site B each protecting each other, right? And that's a standard setup for SRM. Yes, exactly. You'd end up with having the HBR server at both sides because both would be doing recovery for each one. And I believe that's the standard installation, actually, will be to install the HBR servers at both sites with the assumption that even if you do only replicate in one direction to start with, if you ever do switch over, you're going to want to replicate back. I was saying the disks that we write to on the recovery site can be thin, can be thick. They can be. It's independent what those disks look like from what the disk types were on the primary side. So whatever the requirements you have at your recovery site. The HBR management service, so that's the HMS acronym, is the management framework for HBR. And like I said, you can think of this as the SRA for HBR. It fits in that same space, adapting SRM to HBR. It's what orchestrates the creation of test images and failover images. It's what maintains, so the database attached to it is what is maintaining the mapping of source VMDKs and source virtual machines to paths to the destination VMs and VMDKs on the target site. Again, it's a Linux virtual appliance managed entirely through the HBR, to the HMS and SRM UI, so you don't see it directly. You wouldn't, again, have to log into its console. So the question is, will the testing process use VMware snapshots? Not exactly, but we do end up storing the replica disks as a base disk. So there'll be a base disk which contains one of your consistent instances. We create a redo log on top of that base disk into which the next instance sort of accumulates, and then as we get start the instance after that one, we will collapse the redo log in. So what you would see on your target site is a collection of VMDK files and redo logs, sort of 1 or 2 redo logs above that are just tracking the in-progress instance that is trickling over from the primary site. So you shouldn't have to sort of collapse them or create them or anything. That does bring up one thing. We will only be, in the first release, maintaining a single consistent instance, sort of the latest consistent instance that we have at the remote site. And it's important to note that during creation of a test bubble in SRM, replication can continue, the same as it does with array-based replication. While you're running a test, you can still do replications from the primary. We'll be able to do the same thing with HBR. There's one HMS instance per virtual center. So it's not per SRM. So if you're running multiple SRMs, for multiple, there's one site that's a recovery site for multiple primary sites. It's a detail you probably won't need to know, but it scales pretty well by itself. Just to cover some of the limitations in the first version of the product, we'll be focusing on replicating the virtual disks of powered-on virtual machines. So that means if the virtual machine is powered off, replication will be suspended while the VM is off. If you just power cycle the VM, the replication will continue where it left off. But our assumption is if the VM is important enough to be protected, it's probably on. If you have use cases where that's not true, let us know. We will not be replicating the snapshot hierarchy of a virtual machine. So if you create snapshots on the primary side, we're doing the replication at the virtual device layer. So our replication doesn't see any of that complexity. We just replicate a virtual disk over at the other side. So you'd end up with a flat disk on the remote site. We integrate well with snapshots, so you can create snapshots and revert snapshots on a HBR protected virtual machine, and that will work fine. So if snapshots are created as a side effect of your backup software or whatever, that's not a problem. But the snapshots themselves will not be replicated at the remote site. We're only replicating virtual disks, so no floppies or ISOs would get replicated. The first version won't support HBR on a fault-tolerant virtual machine, so you get to choose FT or HBR. And virtual machine templates and linked clones will not be supported with HBR. We don't expect these to be big blockers or anything, but just some corner cases. And the first version of SRM to support HBR won't be able to support the automated reprotection for HBR virtual machines. If you went to there's a talk next door you should be attending if you're not sure what the automated failback for SRM is. So when you're interacting with HBR and using HBR, you may see replications pause, or if you may want to have to figure out why an RPO is being violated. And so just listing out some of the ways that can happen. Like I mentioned, if you pause or suspend a virtual machine, its replication is suspended, so that could create an RPO violation. We try very hard to preserve the consistent instance that as soon as we have one at the remote site. And so if you make a change to a virtual machine, for example, if you add a virtual disk to it, we don't want to replicate. We support replicating a subset of the virtual machine's disks, but we don't want to replicate just the subset that happens to be configured, because that could create a useless instance at the remote site if there's data in the replicated disks that depends on the new disk that you added. So adding a disk to a virtual machine will suspend it until you reconfigure replication to say, yes, I actually want to replicate this new disk, or no, I actually don't want to replicate this new disk. And so that would be an alert in the UI. But we want to make sure that you don't unintentionally make a useful instance at the remote site useless. Other changes to the VM's disk configuration can cause it to suspend. So you can also end up adding and removing disks by reverting snapshots, for example. So we handled that. Again, normal cases for any sort of replication, if you have loss of connectivity or the HBR server goes down at your replica site, that will suspend replication and cause you to see errors in the UI about what's going on. But the recovery will resume after the connectivity is restored or the HBR server comes back up. Most features of vSphere we've worked to make sure those integrate well with HBR. So except for the few I listed out on the slide before, you should be okay to integrate. I think I talked about these RPO violations. One interesting one is storage vMotion of the home directory of a virtual machine will trigger us to go through a resynchronization with the remote side. That doesn't involve sending all the data to the remote side, but it does involve scanning the local disks to figure out where the primary and the remote side differ. So if you storage vMotion just one disk of a virtual machine, that's fine. The replication will have a small hiccup while the storage vMotion is actually flipping over, but during the bulk of the storage vMotion, there should be no interruption to your replication. So you can move a virtual machine from one level of storage to another level, but maintain its replication properties. And through any of these problems that prevent new instances from being created, the old instance is still there, so you can still fail over to that older instance. And then, if you destroy the remote site, that may make recovery difficult. Because we're generating separate virtual disks at the remote site, if there's some problems with a single virtual machine or a single virtual machine's replication, the other virtual machines are just fine. They wouldn't be impacted. So things are pretty naturally isolated to just the one virtual machine, or the virtual machines that were impacted. So in summary, if there are no more questions, HBR is a feature VMware is looking to integrate into SRM. This will enable replication to be configured and controlled through SRM. That configuration of replication will live with the virtual machine as it moves around your infrastructure. The replication properties stay with the virtual machine and are not a property of the storage, which is inherent with array-based replication. At HBR, of course, being storage independent provides the ability to replicate to different types of storage and to replicate virtual machines that live on different types of storage. All of the support necessary for HBR, both at the vSphere and ESX and SRM levels, all of those will have to be up to the release that HBR is a part of.
That's an important point I want to make sure everybody understands. Currently, SRM goes back in time, meaning it supports ESX 3.5. When we release this, HBR will not go back in time. HBR will require changes in the ESX environment, and thus, as an example, you'll only be able to use HBR at that particular release of ESX in the future. So there's another reason why that you'll want to use storage array-based protection in the future is when you're going back to ESX 3.5 hosts where you can't use HBR.
I have a quick architecture question. When you showed the architecture, both sites had virtual centers.
Mm-hmm.
Where I see this would be valuable is, say, a field site that had a single ESX host with a couple of machines that you may want to replicate back. So there would be no virtual center per se out there. Would something like that work, or does each side of the SRM need to have its own virtual center?
So the question is about a remote office that actually has just a single ESX host and no virtual center. How would we actually protect that with HBR? Because as you can see in the diagram here, there's an infrastructure that needs to be there. And that's a really good point. That's actually not an HBR or an SRM question per se. It's about, does that link support virtual center management? In other words, if that remote site has a very slow network connection back to head office, then you can't stash at head office the virtual center and SRM server that you need. So you may actually, on that site, that remote site that has one important virtual machine and one ESX server, you may actually need to put virtual center and SRM onto that, so you'll have 3 VMs. Does that make sense?
I think the short answer to your question is no, but
It is technically.
We had an environment set up where we had a number of remote offices with what we call ESX in a box, so two little things in a NetApp 2020 hanging.
Yeah.
So they could fail over to each other, but they were still all managed from Virtual Center at home base. But what I could see is being able to replicate that data, like any pertinent data, back from there. The VMs, like you wouldn't. I'm not seeing a use for Virtual Center out there because we already have it managing it. It wouldn't be something where we would. I guess the Virtual Center would have to be out there if you wanted to do a failback or something.
It has to be out there to use HBR or SRM. It's just that simple. And that's why I was saying the answer is no, but if you did put Virtual Center and SRM out at that remote site with their DIS on that same 2020, then this would work dandy.
Yeah, as soon as you have Virtual Center,
the limitation of SRM. I mean, you're dumping an NPR that would prevent what you're asking from happening, but because we're complementing with SRM, the SRM requires a BC on both sides.
And the two SRM sites, yeah.
Another question?
Well, would being able to have like a failover between data centers and virtual centers, you would want it?
It's the remote office that's making this interesting and very common. It would be the same virtual center server that's already got SRM in it, and we actually have to have two SRM instances. But you have an interesting idea there, because if you had two data centers and you were able to put the branch office off of the second data center, and you have SRM there, and you have SRM in the second data center, that would be possible.
would those two virtual centers be in link mode, or
I personally,
they don't know about each other?
the question is about link mode. I always use link mode. In fact, all of the screenshots that I took, which is not in this presentation, pardon me, but yes, I always use link mode. Is there a benefit to using linked mode? There most certainly is. There's 4 benefits. First one is it means I only have to have one vSphere client loaded. And within it, I can see both sides. Second one is licensing. When you install licensing in linked mode, the licensing floats everywhere, so that makes a failback a little easier. I don't mean to suggest it allows you to cheat or be dishonest. It just means the license is available everywhere. Permissions will float as well. And I'm forgetting something, but it's a good thing, yes. Yeah?
You don't actually need 2 data centers to do what you want, right? I mean, if you're worried about protecting the home office, you need a vCenter someplace else. But you could run 2 vCenters in his home office.
Data center was little d, meaning, yeah, okay. Any other questions? Oh, I'm sorry, yes, hi. We're not anticipating or unanticipating, and we have no idea, actually. The thing to think about is our new licensing per VM is very simple, it's very clear, and if we're lucky, maybe that's what it'll be.
Is this something that we're shooting for?
Oh, no, don't ask that question. I got into trouble last time I answered that question, so what you need to do is Google, go ask your friends what we answered last time. Because I'm just not going to do it. Did I see a question over here? Okay, yes. Well, you heard the answer. Yes? When this stuff ships, when HBR is provided to the market, we will actually support in SRM the use of HBR and the use of storage arrays. So you will be able to make either decision, and you'll be able to use both of them. Oh, yes, yeah. You can actually, it's wasteful in a way, but you could actually do that. You could have something controlled by HBR that is resting on storage array and being replicated, but the protection groups, we have different protection groups. We have a HBR protection group and we have a storage array protection group, and they can be mixed at the recovery plan level. But yeah, I got a bad feeling about that one. Yeah, and Alan is shaking his head, so he agrees, I think, with the bad feeling. I'm sorry, could you ask that again?
Could the two protection groups protect the same server? So like, if I have a storage replication that's like daily, but I have one server that I want faster, could I use HBR for that?
So you can replicate with the storage at the storage level and at the HBR level, though it's tricky and probably won't do what you want. You cannot put a virtual machine and say that virtual machine is protected both ways. It's either protected by HBR, it's in an HBR protection group, or it's in an array-based replication protection group.
I think we even alert on that if you try and do that.
Yeah, so, right, you can probably sort of set this up, because the big problem is if the storage fails over, the HBR VM went with it, right?
That actually brings up something else. Just give me a moment. You remember how I said there's HBR protection groups and there's storage array protection groups? You need to remember that because in the next future, at some point, in the future, the storage array protection groups, you'll be able to do failback. The HBR protection group, you won't. So that's going to be another decision criteria. Although if you guys now have SRM and you know how to do a failback, which is, of course, a failover in the opposite direction, then HBR not having failback is not that big a deal, in my opinion, because you can do it manually, or you can prepare it manually and then send it back. There was a question over here?
Yeah, you said a comment. You could combine this if you would allow both at the same level. So you could have, like, let's say, a metro distance storage-based application and then send it with your HBR code to a completely different level. I think that would be
So, right, the replication works. The problem is as soon as you do a failover, things, it sort of falls apart. But like if you fail over the storage, then the HBR VM went with the storage.
It's important to understand that HBR has no interface. And even though you guys may be very familiar with storage replication, in the case of HBR, you can't think of it as pure replication. You have to think about it through the lens, so to speak, of SRM. And so what's possible that way? We don't have a separate interface. We don't have separate tools for HBR. It's really a case of SRM using this HBR thing that will be mostly invisible from you to accomplish something a little different. So that is what's going to slow you down a little bit in terms of taking advantage of the storage replication, because you can't take advantage of it the way you can with storage array replication. Yeah?
I just want to echo that HBR piece because I've got customers. Almost every single customer has this office in a box situation.
Mm-hmm.
And to put that whole infrastructure in, it's just really expensive to put it in there. So you can put HBR and just ESX, because it has a problem with this remote office and you replicate back. Like, 50 remote offices, right? In the gaming industry, real
Oil and gas. So yes, you're correct. Your comment about how the branch office in a box kind of idea is extremely common in the world, and having to put the virtual center server and the SRM server and then the appliances all out on that single box out in the field is onerous and expensive. And you're right, and we hear you. But also at the same point, some of those offices that I'm personally familiar with, they got nothing right now. And so even though it might be expensive in 1.0 of this, it might be a little hard, it still may be worth it for some of your customers because they have nothing and they want something. And the product manager is here, and there may be changes in the future, who knows. If enough people ask for something, we definitely listen. And the guy in the white shirt. So they're actually held, just like we do snapshots now, in the same folder that the VM is, and I don't think there's a way to change that.
So when you configure replication, you're talking about at the recovery site, managing the storage? Oh, right. So that's a good question. Generally, so if you have a 24-hour RPO, we just watch which blocks changed. So we only have to, and we won't use any extra storage. It's only when we take the snapshot to make a consistent instance of all the disks. It's not a VMware snapshot. It's like a, snap our fingers and like freeze the IOs in the VM. At that point, we know which blocks we need to send. If, while trying to send those blocks over, the VM writes to that block, then we make a copy. So it's only during the actual replication window. So if you have a 24-hour RPO, the replication window may be like an hour or half an hour of actually copying to the remote site. Only if during that window the VM overwrites the data that we need to copy do we copy it off to the side, and that would be stored on your local storage on the primary site. In the first release, that will be stored in the virtual machine's home directory. So it won't actually even be stored with the virtual disk if that's not in the VM's home directory.
Remember, guys, before you leave, if you're interested in being on the beta program or the potential of being on the beta program, leave your card with me. And did you have a question? So the question is about the frequent change and just how much frequent change can we support.
Right. So effectively the technology inside of HBR is an undo log instead of a redo log. So the data that we keep a copy of is only the overwritten data just during that during that window, and only the first overwrite. So generally when HBR is running, we're just tracking which blocks change. We're not really intercepting the actual data. We're just watching which blocks. So the standard sort of overhead is really lightweight, update a bit in a bitmap on IOs. During the replication window, we may have to copy a block, but it's only the first time the guest touches it. So if the guest is doing a significant IO to a subset of its disk, they will only trigger one copy of those blocks at that time. So we think the sort of the general CPU and overhead, utilization overhead during replication, you'll be hard-pressed to measure. During the replication window, you may see sort of one write become a read and two writes, so a little bit more I/O pressure there, but just during that window, and just once for each block. Yes?
To what extent can I rewind?
The question is, what extent can you rewind? We only preserve one. Currently, we're only going to be preserving one instance on the remote site, so it's sort of the most recent instance is all you'll have to recover to.
We have actually started to ask for that functionality, to be able to have perhaps 2 or 3 on the other side.
I think what we want to talk about today is SRM as the use case. VMware technology obviously can be applied beyond that. What we're working on, what is beyond.
1.0 is something we got to stick to so that we can deliver on time. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, this is the architecture we have to work with, and I agree that the remote offices is a great use case, but we will require interesting designs to exploit it because by the very nature of what HBR does. Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah, definitely, and
I think you guys are headed in the right direction, and I think that's maybe,
We've definitely heard that a lot, and we have some of those remote offices ourselves. Yeah. Thanks very much. Thank you. Did another question?
So why only 15 minutes?
Oh, why is 15 minutes the minimum RPO?
Thanks.
Yeah, that was product marketing said that was good enough. It's mostly because getting the RPO lower it makes the resource requirements and the sort of the optimizations have to be a whole lot better. So it's basically we can get 1.0 out the door with a 15-minute RPO. We should be able to move it down sort of given time. I don't know that we'll get to continuous. You know, there's other technologies that we may get you there, but yeah. Sorry. Yeah, right, and yeah, if you're doing sophisticated things like that, yeah, on array is probably the way to go.